You're listening to the Useful Science Podcast, produced in collaboration with the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center. This week we're talking about social inclusion and well-being. Useful Science is a website where we post one-sentence summaries of scientific research relevant to your everyday life. On this podcast, we'll be on a rotating panel of our science contributors and pick out a few items from the Useful Science archives and dive deep into them. So while the website gives you the short, tweetable version of scientific research, our goal here is to give you the full story. Let's meet our hosts for this week.
Hi, I'm Joshua Conrad Jackson, and I'm a PhD student in the psychology department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I study how culture changes over time and the impact of culture on human psychology.
Hi, I'm Uyên Nguyen. I'm a master's student in the experimental medicine program at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. I study how physical exercise affects the development of the new immune system in bone marrow transplant recipients.
My name is Cameron Spencer. I'm not a scientist. I work on the Useful Science website. I'm a web developer and web designer. So Josh, let's dive into your article.
Thanks, Cameron. This paper is called Does Religion Stave Off the Grave? Religious Affiliation in One's Obituary and Longevity. The lead authors were Laura Wallace and Baldwin Way, who were both at Ohio State University, and it was co-authored with Rebecca Anthony and Christian End. I thought Christian End was a particularly good name for someone doing research on religion and death. So the main focus of this paper is pretty clear from the title. The research team was testing whether religious people live longer than non-religious people. And the way they did this was pretty unconventional. They got samples of lots of obituaries and tested whether people whose obituaries mentioned religion lived longer than people whose obituaries had no mention of religion. So hopefully that's clear. In total, they surveyed 1,601 different obituaries from the United States. 505 of these were from a single city, Des Moines, Iowa, and the remaining 1,096 were from across 42 different U.S. cities. And the research team read each obituary and then indicated a few important pieces of information, including the deceased person's age at their death, their gender, whether religion was mentioned in the obituary, the person's marital status, and the number of social and volunteer activities mentioned. Now, for the sample of obituaries that was gathered across multiple cities, they could also collect data on the personalities of people living in the city using a previous large-scale study of personality differences across America. So, for example, people in cities like New York, on average, report more openness to experience than people living in cities like Wisconsin. And importantly, this wasn't necessarily the personality of the person's obituary, it was the personality on aggregate of the place they lived, if you can wrap your head around that. They also collected data on how religious the city was using freely accessible data from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies, which I learned existed through this article. So the first thing they found a few interesting things. The first thing they found was that people whose obituaries mentioned religion lived longer than people whose obituaries didn't mention religion. And this was about a 5-year gap, which is pretty significant. In the Des Moines sample, people whose obituaries didn't mention religion lived to be about 74 years old, whereas people whose obituaries mentioned religion lived to be about 80 years old. And in the national sample, people whose obituaries didn't mention religion lived to be about 75, whereas people's obituaries who did mention religion lived to be about 79. Now, next they tested whether this could be explained by some of the other data they'd collected from the obituaries. Other than religion, marital status, being female, mentions of volunteer and social activities all predicted length of life. And when the researchers controlled for these other factors, importantly, religion remained associated with longevity. So this means that religion doesn't just predict long life because women are more religious than men or because married people are more religious than single people, even though these other factors, like being a woman or being married, does predict how long you'll live. But they did find that the association between religion and longevity was reduced, so the strength of the association went down after controlling for volunteering and social activities. And so they wrote that engagement in social and charitable activities might be one reason why religious people live longer than non-religious people, because these community volunteer activities are a buffer for long life. And so finally, the researchers tested for where these effects were strongest, and they found that the effects were weakest in cities that were highly religious and cities where people were open to experience. And they have a couple of interesting interpretations of these findings. To explain the religious cities finding, they suggest that in highly religious cities, non-religious people might be able to benefit from the social and charitable outreach of religious people, allowing them to live longer. So they call this the religious spillover effect. And an example of that might be, if you're a homeless person, even if you're an atheist, you get to go to the soup kitchens and community events organized by religious people. Very generous finding for religion. And to explain the openness finding, they suggest that religious people might be less compatible with cities where people are super open to experiences, leading them to be less happy and not live as long, because maybe the norms in these cities clash with more traditional values. So, what does this mean, and why is it useful? I thought I would offer one implication for usefulness and one caveat to wrap the summary up. So first, the implication for usefulness. The study isn't suggesting that everyone go out and convert to Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Instead, it's supporting a claim that psychologists have been making for a long time, that social and community engagement might offer important health benefits, and that since religious people have more social and community engagement, they might be able to take advantage of these health benefits. Before this study, large epidemiological studies found many times that people who are lonely or later in life, especially men, are at greater risk for a variety of health issues, including heart failure. And since religious people go to church together, volunteer together, frequently communicate, they might be more protected from these health risks. But you don't need to be religious to be a nice person. You can do all of these things without actually converting. And then second, the caveat. So the study is a correlational analysis of obituaries, meaning that the association doesn't prove causation. And in this case, it might be that people grow more religious in life, meaning that older people's obituaries might be more likely to mention religion than younger people's obituaries. It might also be that people who die younger are more likely to die from drug abuse or tragic accidents or early onset diseases, and these types of obituaries might be shorter, less likely to mention religion or volunteering, and more likely to talk about the cause of death. And if this were the case, it would suggest that religion doesn't prolong life, rather prolonged life might cause mentions of religion in one's obituaries. But these are just speculations, and the study is really interesting. Moreover, being more socially and communally connected is never a bad thing, so the message is important regardless of whether religion actually leads you to live longer. That's the whole thing.
So I'm not surprised that it makes sense to me that people who are less isolated, who have more social interactions, are healthier and living longer. I think I've heard that before. I wonder also if religion is providing people with a way of relieving stress, a way of dealing with mental health issues, like seeing like in the same way that seeing a therapist might. And that might also be giving people better quality of life and a longer life, if they have that comfort that they draw from religion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It reminds me of this really interesting study they did with HIV patients, where they took HIV patients' prognosis for how long they would live. These were HIV patients who had actually contracted AIDS. And the patients' own prognoses predicted their length of life, even controlling for their actual medical condition when the study started. And so this suggests that the optimism you have, regardless of how healthy you are or not, is actually a really important buffering factor. So that's kind of consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're a religious person in a non-religious area, that those positive effects are mitigated because you're maybe feel like more of an outsider, or you might feel more judged by the community, and so you get less of a positive vibe from it.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think they find the gap is the strongest in non-religious areas, but it's the weakest in the areas that have really high openness to experience. And so, but what you're saying could still be true. It could be that people who are religious and non-religious areas still kind of cluster together and they get that sense of community. But when the culture clashes with the culture of the area, that's when the effect goes down.
Oh, okay. So I also wonder, how accurate are obituaries anyways? I mean, presumably the obituary is written by the descendants of the person who passed away. And if those descendants are religious, they might be likely to play up the religiosity of the person who passed away. Or if they're not religious, they might omit that from the obituary. Like, I wonder if this is just bad data.
Yeah, it's totally true. I mean, that's the danger with collecting those obituaries. Like, if your children are super religious, then they're going to write about how much you engaged in your religious activities, even if you didn't really do anything. I'm trying to think of how that would lead to this effect.
Yeah.
Like, why would this lead people who have mentions in their obituaries to live longer?
Here's a totally crazy theory. This is going off the rails, but maybe the obituaries that don't mention religion are just less detailed overall. Maybe they just have less personal information. And maybe that's because that person who passed away is less connected with the person who's writing the obituary.
Yeah.
And that could also have to do with those lacking social connections.
That could be true. And relatedly, it could be that the older you get, the more likely that your children are going to step in and take control of how you're portrayed after life, like your assets and the way that your obituary reads. And so, it might be that people who are older might have children who are older and likely to be more religious, and it might be kind of like a cohort effect, like the children grew up in a different time than the younger children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You could do a study that looked at something else like knitting, people whose obituaries mentioned knitting.
Yeah.
And maybe you might find the exact same correlation with life expectancy.
Yeah, doing crosswords with your partner leads you to live longer.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I actually looked up like how to write an obituary.
Nice.
So they suggest that we should write about our hobbies and what we do in our free time, what we enjoy doing. So maybe like the children of the descended, they were very religious and they want to write more about how their parents or whatever serve the community and God.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this tension in these big studies because you can't collect data from people after they've died. You can't ask people after they've died, how religious were you? And so when this paper came out, it was in a field sort of close to my own, and it had a big impact because it was getting a kind of data that no one had gotten before. But then as soon as you really start thinking about it, you can come up with all these design flaws, like what you just brought up, Ewan, and some of the things that you were bringing up, Cameron. And so there's always this trade-off, and so I guess the best you can do is to take it with a grain of salt. Although it would be really cool to introduce some other controls about what else was mentioned in the obituary beyond just the demographic information, because that would get at whether it's something about the people writing the obituary less than something about the person whose obituary it is.
Well, oh yeah, and you know what would be really cool? If we have access to the obituaries of the children who wrote the obituaries of the individuals included in the study to see if they kind of match up.
Like a never-ending loop of obituaries. Well, I mean, the best predictor of whether you're religious is whether your parents were religious. And so I'm guessing they'll match up quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think that just one really obvious control variable that I didn't see in this paper was just how long the obituary is. Because longer obituaries are going to mention all these things more often. And longer obituaries might also belong to people that lived a long time and touched a lot of people around them. And so that was one that I thought would have been pretty easy to put in. But the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
Have either of you guys heard of any other studies using obituaries?
No.
No, this is my first one.
Yeah. It's a really interesting source of study. I'd be really interested to just see trends in how obituaries have changed. Like, there's this famous book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, the sociologist, and it suggests that people are more and more often doing things by themselves and that the kind of community heart of America is falling apart. And it seems that obituaries would be a perfect opportunity to test these kind of hypotheses. Are our obituaries mentioning more and more about our personal accomplishments and speaking less and less about the kind of community we were embedded in? Mm-hmm. And then that would have really interesting consequences for longevity and would fit with the kind of theme of this episode, social inclusion and well-being.
I can't imagine going bowling alone.
Right?
I go to movies alone, and I go out to eat alone. Some people think that's weird. That's fine, but bowling, that's a little strange.
The whole book is based on this really, really cool survey called the American Time Use Survey. and it just has all of these activities that you have to indicate if you're taking the survey. And it's just really large studies, lots of people, and all sorts of weird things you can find in it. Like a lot of people go bowling by themselves, a lot of people go to the movies by themselves, but also just like the kinds of activities they include are really fun. I wish I had some examples, but it's free to download. And so like if you're a young student out there and you're thinking, I'm not able to get any data to analyze, the American Time Use Survey has some fascinating stuff.
Would you play putt-putt golf alone?
I just feel like it would lack the challenge. Like when I play putt-putt golf, it's just for the competition. Like I like to beat the young children around me. So
I suppose people golf alone all the time.
Yeah, I played golf, and I used to go by myself, and it was really peaceful. You just put your headphones in, and so I could imagine. Putt-putt golf is another story, though.
Putt-putt golf is not peaceful.
Yeah, it's all about the intensity.
All right, should we move on? Anything else on this article?
Yeah, I think we've kind of strayed away from the main point.
Okay, great. Ewan, let's dive into your article.
The title of my paper is The Unforeseen Cost of Extraordinary Experience. And the authors were Gus Cooney and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard and Timothy Wilson at University of Virginia. So the basic premise of the paper is that people seek extraordinary experiences, from taking exotic vacations to swimming with sharks, and then talk about those experiences. But if you were talking to a group of people who did not have the same extraordinary experience, the study found that you would likely feel excluded in that social interaction. So what is considered an extraordinary experience? The authors vaguely define this to be both different from and better than the experiences that most other people have. And the example they gave was how there were 600 people who had paid at least $250K to secure a spot on one of the world's first commercial spacecraft, soon to be launched by Virgin Galactic. So extraordinary experiences have two consequences. The first being that they're very enjoyable. Like personally, I wouldn't mind floating weightless and gazing at the planet for a few minutes. But such experiences can make the people who have them, quote unquote, strangers to everyone else on Earth. At worst, people may be envious and resentful towards those with an incredible experience, and at best they may find themselves with little to talk about. So previous studies have shown that we typically talk about the things we have in common, and an afternoon in orbit is not one of them. So to prepare for their big studies, the researchers recruited 76 pre-test participants and had them watch 4 different videos. So these were 10-minute long. After watching the video, participants were asked to rank the movie from 0 to 5 stars, and on a scale of 1 to 100, how they felt while watching the movie. So based on their response, the researchers selected 2 videos for use in study number 1. So one was a video of a talented street magician performing tricks for an appreciative crowd. It received a mean rating of 4.2 stars, and thus was referred to as a 4-star video. This was the extraordinary experience. The other video was a low-budget animation that received a mean rating of 2.25 stars and thus was referred to as a 2-star video, or the ordinary experience. I actually tried to find these 2 videos to watch myself, but I couldn't find them, unfortunately.
Well, it's probably for the best, because otherwise you'd feel socially excluded as you were explaining them, right?
Yes. So for the first study, they recruited 68 Harvard students. Each session had 4 participants. When they arrived, they were seated in individual cubicles, and they had to answer the question, how do you feel right now, by marking a 100-point scale from not very good to very good. This was the baseline emotion. The participants were told that there were 2 videos, a 4-star video and a 2-star video. So next, one participant was randomly assigned to watch the 4-star video, while the other 3 were assigned to watch the 2-star video. So all participants were told which video they and the other participants had been assigned to watch. So after they finished watching their video, they were put into a room, seated around a table, and told to talk amongst themselves for 5 minutes. So 5 minutes later, the experimenter returned escorted them back to their cubicles, where they answered 2 questions. The first one being, how do you feel right now? And the other one, how did you feel during the interaction that took place? And the 2 options, it was on a scale of 1 to 100, included to excluded. So the researchers found that after the social interaction, the extraordinary experiencers felt worse and more excluded than the ordinary experiencers did. What is more interesting is that using statistical mediation analysis, I tried to understand this, but it was quite complicated. The authors found that while the direct effect of pre-interaction experience on post-interaction feelings was not significant, the indirect effect through self-perceived exclusion was significant. So this means that the participants who watched the 4-star video felt excluded during the subsequent social interaction, and this left them feeling worse than the participants who had the ordinary experience. So after reading about this first study, I thought that it would have been useful to know whether the 2-star video viewers actually ganged up on the 4-star video viewers, or was the feeling of being excluded completely self-perceived? So the researchers could have, say, recorded a discussion or something. I also think that had the researchers asked the participants how they felt immediately after watching the video and before the networking session, they would have, 1, confirmed that the videos convey the same feelings as they did on the pre-test participants, and 2, picked up on signs of anxiety, if there were any, that the extraordinary experiencer had before being put into the same room with 3 other people who all had shared the same inferior experience, knowing that those 3 also knew that the extraordinary experiencer, him or herself, had experienced something more special. I mean, I would be nervous going into such a situation. But 5 minutes are not very long. Maybe the participants did not have enough time to find something they have in common, or they felt that they were supposed to talk about the video they had just watched. Nevertheless, it's surprising how the extraordinary experiencers could feel excluded in such a brief interaction. So in subsequent studies, study 2 and 3, the participants were asked to predict how they and others would feel in these circumstances. So in the second study, 100 participants were recruited online. So I think everything was done online. Yeah, they were asked to imagine the whole study 1 procedure with themselves as one of the participants, and then predict how they would feel, not very good to very good, at 3 different time points while watching the video, during the 5-minute group discussion, and after the group interaction in their separate cubicles. So the cool part is the participants had to make these predictions in 2 different sets, as both the 2 and the 4-star video viewers. Hence, they had to make predictions on how the extraordinary and the ordinary experiencers would feel. So the results showed that participants correctly predicted that the extraordinary experience would leave them feeling better than the ordinary experience would before the interaction, so similar to how the pre-test participants felt, but they failed to realize that it would leave them feeling worse after the interaction, which is what study 1 showed. So it's worth noting that the participants in study number 2 were different from study number 1. So they did not watch the study number 2 participants did not watch either of the videos, nor did they actually socialize with other participants. So the predicted and actual feeling scores that were compared in the paper were not from the same individuals, so they were not matched. So similar to study number 2, the third study also recruited 100 participants online, but this time they were asked to take on the third person perspective and imagine 4 people taking part in the study. So they were asked to make predictions on how each of the 4 participants would feel after the 5-minute social interaction, and to estimate the percentage of interaction time each of the 4 participants would spend talking. Did the participants expect the extraordinary experiencer to be excluded from the interaction? No. In fact, they predicted that the extraordinary experiencer would talk more and feel better than the ordinary experiencers. So, to explain why the participants in studies 2 and 3 failed to predict the social costs of the extraordinary experience, the authors proposed 3 possibilities. Number 1, participants in studies 2 and 3 may have thought more about the effects of the extraordinary experience than about the effects of the social interaction, simply because the former was more imminent and vivid. 2, it's difficult to predict social dynamics, and the participants may simply have been wrong. And lastly, the participants may have underestimated how bad the exclusion would make the extraordinary experiencer feel. Exclusion makes people feel bad only when it signals rejection by other people. So participants may have expected the extraordinary experiencer to be excluded from the conversation without realizing that the extraordinary experiencer would feel rejected. And even if they did realize it, they may have underestimated just how bad that rejection might feel. So what does this all mean? Having incredible experiences can sometimes spoil our interactions with those who did not share them, and that we cannot always predict when this will happen. This study shows that This study shows that extraordinary experiences can have social costs, but it doesn't mean they must. You can have all the extraordinary experiences that you want, but talking about them can be tricky, and our words often bear little resemblance to the real thing. So conversation is something we construct together, so it thrives on what we have in common. So maybe talk about the cool experience that you have, but then at the end try to link back and connect with the other person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good summary of the article. I think the thing that struck me about this article when I read it is, are YouTube videos really extraordinary experiences?
That's what I was wondering. Like, I wouldn't be that excited about hearing about my friend's very cool YouTube video that he saw.
Yeah,
but if he went to space...
Check out this YouTube video. It's got 4.2 stars.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I guess it's because, I don't know, like in my mind, like a video with only 2 stars is relatively worse, but it would also make me feel bad having to watch it knowing that the other person gets to watch something better. I mean, I'm a crazy moviegoer, so maybe I don't want to kind of waste time watching something that is not considered good.
It almost seems like, so they've got some people watching these 2-star videos, and then they've got a single person watching this 4-star video. And it seems like they're varying a ton of things at the same time, because you got it like, how bad is a 2-star video? I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube, and they tend to have high star ratings. And so it must be that, it seems to me that maybe it's just that I would want to bond with someone who's watched a terrible video.
Oh, that's a
more
good point.
so than I would want to talk about my ordinary experiences.
Mm-hmm. So it's not like they felt the pressure to talk about the videos that they watch, but that they want to bond with the other person or the other people who watch the same video. That's a good point.
Well, there's all this research showing that pain brings people together. You know, like hazing rituals are everywhere, and people think that's for a reason because they build cohesion. And it seems that if I'm going into a study and I watch something that's just truly terrible, I would think that that's pretty funny, and I want to talk to some other study participant. Like, why did they make us watch this stupid video? Whereas, like, watching a street performer, that seems like bread and butter YouTube.
Yeah. Well, so in that case, then that would be really funny, because in that case, watching a 2-star video would actually be the extraordinary experience.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the other thing is they've kind of stacked the deck in their favor, because they've got this one person watching the extraordinary video. And I guess that's because not everyone gets to go to space. And so it makes sense. But it would have been nice if they could have separated the kind of doing the really cool thing with just doing something by yourself and not having everyone around. Because it could be that if they had just got one person to watch the 2-star video, that person would have felt really excluded because everyone else is talking about this awesome street performer they watched.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
So that could be another control that they should have included in the study. Yeah, maybe the exclusion that the extraordinary experiencer felt was not from the level the level of excitement that the experience brought about. It's more of the fact that they were the only person in the whole group of people who experienced that.
Have you guys ever seen Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
Yeah, when I was little.
Yeah, there's this scene when they get back from their journey and they're all sitting in the Green Dragon or whatever the pub is called back in the Shire, and everyone else is going about their day, and there's a guy with a pumpkin and everyone's having fun and they can't really relate to anyone. I think that there's a truth to that feeling.
Yeah, that's a good point. This guy's like, you brought in this really big pumpkin, this like random dude, and everybody's like, wow, check out this amazing pumpkin. And then like our heroes who like fought an army of orcs are just sitting there quietly being ignored. And that is kind of an evocative scene. That scene did stick with me. That's a good example.
And so I think that's kind of the logic behind this paper, and I get it. But on the other hand, I wish they could have tested it a little more thoroughly. It seems like there are more studies to be done.
Yeah.
But it's still a really provocative point. I don't know if you guys have you ever felt like you couldn't relate an extraordinary experience because everyone was just talking about their ordinary experiences?
I feel like I have been the receiver of both ends.
Oh, yeah?
So like, for instance, when I was in Boston like 2 summers ago, and then I went back, and when I talked to my friend about all the cool museums that I visited during my time in Boston, sometimes like at the beginning they were very excited to hear about them, but then it kind of they kind of like dozed off, like they lost their attention, and then we ended up talking about something else. But at the same time, like sometimes when I talk to a very good friend of mine, she would bring up these really cool movies and books that she watched and read, and I have not seen any of them. It would also make me feel excluded because I cannot join the conversation with her. Yeah. And
so you're saying that being on the receiving end of an extraordinary experience can also make you feel excluded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I think it's they kind of talk about the two elements of extraordinary experiences, as you mentioned, the part that this is something that no one else does, and then it's something that's really positive. And I think it's really the part that no one else does that makes people feel excluded. And it's like a really simple message that if you're hearing or speaking about something that that the other people don't seem to relate to, then that's an alienating feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there's extraordinary experiences that you can relate to, or at least that you can make sense of, like somebody going to space, like you can understand a little bit about what that means, and you can hear about that and probably find it really interesting. But if somebody's got some niche interest, like let's say they're like a skateboarder, and they're talking about how they just learned how to kickflip or whatever, and you're like, I don't know what a kickflip is. I don't know anything about skateboarding. I don't know if that's hard or easy or what. Like, maybe that's an extraordinary experience, or maybe it's a boring experience. It doesn't matter because I don't understand what that means. Or like in my life, I am involved with a bunch of marching band stuff. I teach a high school marching band, and we do this activity called Winter Percussion, which is kind of has roots in marching band. And in the summer, I'm a fan of this thing called Drum Corps, which is like a marching band activity that's at like a high level. But I have a hard time talking with that stuff about people because I feel like in order for them to relate to it, I would have to sit them down for 45 minutes and explain all the details about it. So I don't talk about it with people really, except for people that are also involved in that world.
And that could also be the case if you had a terrible experience as part of your marching band, like some terrible, like some percussionist messed up and played at the wrong time and you couldn't hear the rest of the band. And then that would probably be something that would also be difficult to explain, even though it was a negative thing.
Yeah.
Like the time that we were on tour in Texas and we all had horrible diarrhea because nobody told us that the water wasn't safe to drink.
Well, that's a universal.
So so like there was like 100 of us all sick at the same time.
Wow.
Oh.
I guess that is relatable.
Yeah, I think that point about space is really good because that is unquestionably an extraordinary experience, but it's something that we're all thinking about, even if we aren't doing it. And so when we get to speak to somebody who's been to space, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Because we've all seen Gravity. Maybe if they made more movies about street performers, this experiment would have gone better.
Hey, listener, if you're in the Bay Area, California Bay Area, go to SF MoMA and see their space exhibit that's going on right now. It's called Far Out, and they've got basically all this art around like space habitats and spacesuits and stuff. Is extremely cool.
Wow.
I went there yesterday.
That is cool. And you can test this study. You can see what happens when you tell other people about it.
There we go.
Ooh, and then let us know.
Or we can see if our listenership drops off after we talk about these extraordinary experiences, and then we'll know. So what's the takeaway? What should people do? Should we talk about our experiences or not?
Well, we should talk about our experiences, but we should also make the listener feel included.
Yeah.
That seems to be the key. Do you ever watch space documentaries on Netflix just to keep with the same theme?
Not really.
I don't have Netflix.
Anyway, I've seen a couple of them. I'm not a huge consumer, but I've seen a couple of them, and I've noticed something that the astronauts do really well is use metaphors. You know, they say things like, do you know when you're on this trampoline and then for a moment you feel totally out of control? Well, this is how this felt. Or do you remember, have you ever been locked in a refrigerator, like a walk-in refrigerator? Like, that's how this felt. And so maybe the people in this study just weren't using enough relatable metaphors. Maybe that's another takeaway.
That is a very good point. I should probably use more metaphors when describing my research to my parents as well.
Yeah.
So they say you should spend money on experiences. I remember seeing a study about that if you have let's say you have $5,000 to spend, you're going to get more long-term happiness if you spend that on a vacation than you will if you go out and buy a fancy TV or something.
That's really interesting. I've wondered about that myself.
Yeah, I remember reading that in a Richard Wiseman book called 60 Seconds, which is like a self-help book that's based around research.
Maybe some fodder for a future episode. That would be really cool to dive into.
Maybe so. Well, shall we wrap things up?
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. Please email us your feedback at podcast@usefulscience.org. You can send us feedback or questions there. We always like hearing from listeners. You can also interact with us on Reddit at /r/usefulscience. We post each episode there, so you can have a conversation there on Reddit about that. And you can follow us on Twitter at usefulsci. I want to thank our editor from Moorhead Planetarium, Vivian Lee. I want to thank the composer for our intro music, Solomon Krauss and La. My name is Cameron Spencer. You can follow me on Twitter at Usonic, EUSONIC.
My name is Joshua Conrad Jackson. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh_C_Jackson.
And you can also follow me on Twitter as well. I'm Uyen on Twitter. I am Wonder Uyen, so Wonder and then UYEN. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a very useful week.